We need to make this clear before we begin. This is one of the most disturbing and difficult cases we've ever covered on this channel, not because of a single moment, but because of what was allowed to happen over time. What you're about to hear isn't just a crime story. It's a slow, silent tragedy that went on for years. And the most unsettling part, it didn't happen in secret. On January 3rd, 2022, a 911 call came in from Slaughter, Louisiana. A mother's voice on the line. Calm, almost too calm. She said she had just found her daughter unresponsive on the couch. That daughter was Lacey Ellen Fletcher. She was 36 years old. But what first responders discovered inside that home was something even seasoned investigators struggled to process, because they couldn't believe what they were seeing. The picture of what they saw stayed with them long after they left that house. Before we get to that moment, we need to go back, because stories like this don't start with tragedy, they start quietly. Lacey Fletcher was born on November 25th, 1985, and from everything we can gather, she wasn't so different from other children. She had a family, a home, a life that, at least on the surface, seemed stable. But there were early signs that something wasn't quite right. Lacey was autistic, and like many individuals on the spectrum, she experienced the world differently, more intensely, more vulnerably. School, especially high school, became a difficult place for her. There were reports of bullying, isolation, moments where she didn't quite fit in. And we have to pause here for a second, because this is often where the story could have gone differently. Support, intervention, understanding, those are the things that can change outcomes. But instead, her parents, Sheila Fletcher and Clay Fletcher, made a decision. They pulled her out of school. They chose to homeschool her. Now, on the surface, that doesn't sound alarming. A lot of parents homeschool for good reasons, but in this case, it became the beginning of something much darker. We start to see a pattern, a slow withdrawal, not just from school, but from the outside world entirely. Friends? Gone. Routine? Gone. Structure? Gone. And when someone is already vulnerable, that kind of isolation doesn't just pause development, it can reverse it. By the time Lacey was in her early 20s, something had changed. There was a noticeable decline in her cognitive and physical state. She began to withdraw even more, and eventually, she stopped leaving the house altogether. Think about that. Not just avoiding social situations, not just staying indoors occasionally, but completely losing the ability, or perhaps the will, to step outside. Now, here's where the story becomes difficult. Not just because of what happened, but because of what didn't happen. There was no consistent medical intervention, no structured therapy, no long-term care plan, and this is where we need to start asking uncomfortable questions. Because when someone becomes that dependent, someone else has to step in. Her parents were there, living in the same house, seeing her every day, and yet instead of escalation towards help, towards treatment, there was a kind of stillness, a quiet acceptance, or maybe even avoidance. Over time, Lacey became confined to one place, a couch in the living room. At first, maybe it didn't seem permanent. Maybe it started as rest, fatigue, withdrawal, a bad period, but days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and eventually years. And this is where we need to slow down and really think about the psychology of this situation, because it's easy to ask, how could this happen? But the more important question is, how does something like this continue for so long? There's a concept in psychology called gradual normalization. It means that when something changes slowly enough, people begin to accept it as normal. one small compromise at a time, one ignored warning sign at a time, until eventually, what would once have been unthinkable becomes routine. Imagine walking past that living room every day, seeing your daughter in the same spot, not moving, not improving, and instead of doing something to help, you just decide not to care. You adapt. You tell yourself, she's fine. She prefers this. This is temporary. Even when it clearly isn't. And this is where the emotional weight of this story really begins to build. Because from everything we know, Lacey wasn't completely unresponsive. There were signs, subtle but real, indications that she was aware, that she was experiencing discomfort, that she was trying at times to move, to shift, to escape the position she was in. And we have to sit with that for a moment, because that changes everything. This wasn't someone who had disappeared mentally. This was someone who was still there, trapped in a body that was slowly giving up, in an environment that wasn't changing. Now, if you're listening to this and you're already feeling unsettled, that's completely normal, because this story isn't just about a crime. It's about neglect, about missed intervention, about what happens when responsibility is abandoned slowly instead of suddenly. And this is also where we want to say something important to you. If you're drawn to stories like this, stories that try to understand the why behind the worst human behaviors, make sure you subscribe to the channel, because every case we cover isn't just about what happened. It's about understanding it, so we can recognize the signs before it's too late. As time passed, Lacey's condition didn't improve. It worsened. Her body began to weaken. Muscle movement became limited. And the longer she stayed in one position, the harder it became to leave it. This is what's known as physical atrophy. When muscles aren't used, they deteriorate. And once that process starts, it doesn't reverse easily, especially without medical intervention. So now we have a situation where a vulnerable individual is isolated. There's no external oversight, no medical support, and physical decline is accelerating. And yet, the outside world remains unaware. Neighbors didn't intervene, community members didn't raise alarms, and that raises another uncomfortable reality. Not all tragedies happen in secret. Some happen in the plain sight, but go unnoticed because no one looks closely enough. And inside that house, the situation continued, day after day, month after month, year after year. What started as isolation was slowly becoming something else entirely, something far more dangerous, something irreversible. And as we move into the next part of this story, we're going to see how that neglect didn't just continue, it escalated into conditions that are almost impossible to comprehend, into suffering that no one should ever experience. Because the truth is, Lacey Fletcher didn't disappear overnight. She disappeared slowly, right in front of the people who were supposed to protect her. By now, Lacey Ellen Fletcher had become almost entirely confined to that couch, not just by circumstance, but by a combination of physical decline, psychological withdrawal, and something even more disturbing, neglect that had become routine. At some point, this stopped being temporary and became permanent. Let's think about daily life inside that house, because this is where we start to understand the reality, not just the headlines. There was no structured care, no scheduled feeding routine that met nutritional needs, no hygiene assistance in any meaningful, consistent way. Instead, there were adaptations. Towels were placed nearby, not to help Lacey recover, but to manage the consequences of her condition, to make cleanup easier. And that detail matters more than it seems, because it tells us something very specific about the mindset inside that home. This wasn't a situation where help was being actively pursued and failing. This was a situation where the environment was being adjusted to accommodate decline. In psychology, this is sometimes referred to as passive neglect, not always driven by direct intent to harm, but by avoidance, detachment, and, over time, emotional disconnection. But here's where things become more complicated, because the neglect didn't exist in isolation. There were contradictions. The rest of the house, reportedly clean, maintained, organized, which creates a disturbing contrast. One space in the home was being preserved. Another was being ignored. And when we see contrasts like that, we have to ask a deeper question. Was this inability, or was it a choice? As time passed, Lacey's physical condition continued to deteriorate. Her muscles weakened further, movement became even more limited, and with that, her dependence became total. But even then, there were signs she was still trying. Small attempts, subtle movements, indications that she wasn't entirely resigned to her situation, and this is one of the most emotionally difficult aspects of this case, because it suggests awareness, effort, a desire, however small, to change her position, to relieve discomfort, to escape. But without support, those efforts weren't enough. Now, let's talk about something that often gets overlooked in cases like this: time distortion. When neglect becomes long-term, people inside that environment begin to lose track of urgency. Days blur together. What should feel like an emergency starts to feel normal. And that's how something that should have triggered immediate intervention continues. But the environment inside that house didn't just stay the same. It worsened, gradually, then significantly. Basic needs weren't being met. Nutrition became inconsistent, and over time, severely inadequate. This led to malnourishment, a condition that doesn't just weaken the body. It affects cognition, energy, emotional regulation. It makes recovery even harder. And then there's something even deeper we need to address: isolation. Lacey wasn't just physically confined, she was socially and emotionally cut off. No external contact, no regular interaction outside of her parents, no one checking in, no one asking questions. And when isolation reaches that level, it removes one of the most important safety nets a person can have: visibility. Because people can only intervene when they know something is wrong. Now, here's where the case takes another turn that's difficult to process. There were periods where Sheila Fletcher and Clay Fletcher would leave the house for days. Think about that. Leaving someone in that condition, without direct care, without supervision, without support. And this is where we have to confront something uncomfortable, because at this point, we're no longer talking about passive neglect alone. We're talking about prolonged absence in a situation that clearly required constant attention. And yet, life outside that living room continued. Vacations, time away, moments of normalcy, which creates a psychological disconnect that's hard to reconcile. How do you step out here into the world while something like this is happening inside your home? There are a few possible explanations psychologists often explore in cases like this. Denial, convincing yourself the situation isn't as bad as it is; emotional numbing, gradually losing the ability to feel urgency or concern. Avoidance, choosing distance over confrontation. Rationalization, creating justifications to reduce guilt. But even with those explanations, there's still a gap between understanding behavior and accepting its consequences. As Lacey's condition worsened, her body began to show signs of extreme physical stress, weakness, inability to reposition herself, dependence on others for even the most basic needs. And remember, those needs weren't being fully met. Over time, the situation around her became increasingly unsafe, not just uncomfortable, but hazardous. And this is where we need to be careful in how we describe things, because the reality is deeply disturbing, but what matters most is understanding what it represents. It represents a complete breakdown of care, a situation where intervention didn't just fail, it never truly began. And yet, despite everything, there were still signs, evidence that Lacey was trying in whatever limited way she could, trying to shift her body, trying to relieve pressure, trying to endure, and that's something we don't want to lose sight of, because it reminds us she wasn't invisible, she wasn't gone, she was still there. And that's what makes this story so difficult, not just what happened, but how long it continued. Now, if you've made it this far, we want to pause for a moment, because stories like this aren't easy to hear, but they matter. They matter because they force us to recognize patterns, to understand warning signs, and to ask questions we might otherwise avoid. If you value that kind of storytelling, stories that go beyond headlines and explore the deeper why, make sure you subscribe, because every case we cover is about awareness as much as it is about truth. We want you to picture this moment carefully. It's January 3rd, 2022, a quiet day in Slaughter, Louisiana, nothing unusual on the surface, until a call comes in. A 911 operator picked up. On the other end, a voice. It's Sheila Fletcher. She says her daughter isn't breathing, that she's unresponsive on the couch. Now, on calls like this, there's usually panic, confusion, urgency. But what stood out to many people later was how controlled everything sounded, measured, almost distant. The operator begins guiding her through CPR instructions, step by step. And in the background, there are sounds, effort, movement. But something about it doesn't quite match the situation, because by the time that call was made, Lacey Ellen Fletcher had already been gone. When emergency responders arrived at the house, what they walked into wasn't just a medical emergency. It was a scene that would stay with them, a scene that many of them later said they could not forget. And we're not going to focus on graphic details here, but we do need to understand the reality of what they found. Lacey was on the couch, where she had been for years, her body showing clear signs of long-term neglect, severe physical deterioration, malnourishment, and conditions that no human being should ever have to endure. Investigators quickly realized something critical. This wasn't sudden, this wasn't unexpected. This had been building for a very long time, and almost immediately, the story being told by her parents began to raise questions. Clay Fletcher and Sheila claimed that Lacey had chosen to live this way, that she refused help, that this had been her decision. Now, on the surface, that might sound like an explanation, but when you look closer, it begins to fall apart, because choice requires capacity. And by every indication, Lacey had reached a point where she no longer had the physical ability to change her situation on her own. So the question becomes unavoidable. If she couldn't help herself, who was responsible for helping her? The investigation moved quickly because the evidence wasn't subtle, it wasn't hidden, it was right there in the open. Medical examiners conducted an autopsy, and the conclusion was clear. This was not a natural death. It was ruled a homicide, not because of a single act of violence, but because of prolonged neglect, the kind that happens over time, the kind that's harder to see, but just as devastating. And this is where the case takes on a deeper psychological weight. Because We're not dealing with a moment of rage or a sudden loss of control. We're dealing with something slower, something quieter, something that unfolds in the absence of action, which raises a difficult truth. Sometimes harm doesn't come from what people do, but from what they choose not to do. As investigators processed the scene, many of them reported emotional distress, difficulty sleeping, loss of appetite, and that tells us something important, because these are professionals, people who have seen difficult cases before. But this one was different, because it forced them to confront a kind of suffering that wasn't hidden in the shadows. It happened in a home, over years, within reach of help. In May 2022, both Sheila and Clay Fletcher were arrested, charged with second-degree murder, and for a moment, it seemed like the legal system was moving toward a clear outcome. But cases like this are rarely straightforward. There were legal challenges, arguments about intent, about responsibility, about how to classify a crime that didn't happen in a single moment, but over more than a decade. At one point, the charges were even dismissed, which raised another wave of questions, another layer of uncertainty. But the case didn't end there. A grand jury re-indicted them in 2023, bringing the charges back, pushing the case forward again. And as the legal process continued, the central question remained the same. How do you measure accountability in a case built on years of inaction? Then in February 2024, there was a shift. Both Sheila and Clay entered a plea, no contest. In exchange, the charge was reduced from second-degree murder to manslaughter. Now, this is where opinions begin to divide, because on one hand, a conviction means accountability. It means recognition that something went wrong. But on the other hand, a reduced charge raises questions about whether the full weight of what happened was truly reflected in the outcome. If they had been convicted of second-degree murder, they would have faced life in prison, no parole. Instead, in March 2024, they were sentenced to 20 years, with an additional suspended sentence of 20 years. And this is where we step back, because beyond the legal outcome, there's something deeper to understand. This case isn't just about what happened to Lacey. It's about the systems around her, the lack of intervention, the absence of oversight, the missed opportunities to step in. Because cases like this don't exist in isolation. They reveal gaps in awareness, in responsibility, in action. And they force us to ask a question that's uncomfortable, but necessary. How many warning signs does it take before something is done? Now, as we come to the end of this story, we want to bring it back to where we started. That looked normal, a life that from the outside didn't raise alarms, and a person who slowly disappeared without ever leaving. If there's one thing this case teaches us, it's that silence can be just as dangerous as action. That neglect doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like nothing happening at all. And that's why stories like this matter, because they remind us to look closer, to ask questions, to check in. If someone is withdrawing, if something doesn't feel right, those instincts matter. And if you've stayed with us till this point, we appreciate you. These aren't easy stories to hear, but they're important. If you want more true crime stories that go beyond what they want you to see, but also explore the psychology, the warning signs, and the deeper truths, make sure you subscribe to the channel, drop your thought in the comment section, and turn on your notification. Because awareness is one of the few things that can actually prevent stories like this from repeating. This was the story of Lacey Ellen Fletcher, and a case that reminds us that sometimes the most disturbing crimes aren't the ones that happen in an instant. They're the ones that happen slowly, over time, in silence. And by the time they're discovered, it's already too late.